like to welcome everybody to the Vashon Heritage Museum talks. Tonight's talk is on the mosquito fleet, and a reminder that your microphone is muted for this talk. You will only see the speaker, not others. If you have a question during the talk, please type it in the chat function and we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. I'd also like to take this moment to recognize and to thank For Culture for sponsoring our museum talks. I'm Elsa Kruhenquist, the Executive Director of the Heritage Museum. And as is our tradition, we open our talks with recognition of the Native people. And I'd like to introduce Chris Austin, a Vashon Heritage Museum board member and co-producer of our talk series, to read the recognition statement. And could you please change the slide?
Thank you, Elsa. We acknowledge and recognize that we are on the ancestral lands and traditional home of the Shrobaps Coast Salish Native people, the first people of Vashon Island. This land was their home long before Euro-American voyagers and settlers came, and they forcibly removed them from these lands and relocated them to neighboring reservations, including Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. Vashon Island is their traditional home, and their historical relationship with the land continues today. We honor, we honor the island itself and the Shrobaps people, past and present.
Thank you, Chris. And now the Vashon Heritage Museum Inclusion Pledge. Vashon-Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. I'd like to introduce this evening's presenter, Jean Findlay. Jean is a retired teacher, Vashon Heritage Museum board member emeritus, member of the Collections and Archives Committee, past chair of the Education Committee, and co-author of Images of America, Mosquito Fleet of South Puget Sound. Jean, welcome.
Thank you, Elsa. Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and welcome to everybody out there in Cyberland. As Elsa said, I'm going to talk about the mosquito fleet. I'm going to tell stories about the mosquito fleet. This is not a real technical talk, but I am going to assume that a lot of you are local and know places and names that I will mention about Vashon Island. So be forewarned. The mosquito fleet is our steamboats, and these are the steamboats that serve Vashon Island that I'm going to talk about. And these are boats that lived for more than a century between 1836, when the Beaver arrived on the Sound, and about 1942, when the Concordia of Quartermaster Harbor was withdrawn from regular passenger service. All the steamboats were called the Mosquito Fleet. Well, Mosquito Fleet, that's a weird name, but there's a story that goes with it. An office worker glanced out of his window, which overlooked Elliott Bay in Seattle, and it was during commuting time. Well, commuting, you say. Commuters, you know, back in 1900. As one example, a lot of people did work in Bremerton at the Naval Shipyard. Well, at the shipyard, it wasn't just naval at that time. And a lot of people from Seattle did go there to work. This large shipyard was established in 1891, and it's still in operation today. Anyway, this office worker noticed the multitude of steamers scurrying around the harbor and coming and going, and he said, "Why, that looks just like a swarm of mosquitoes." And apocryphal or not, that name stuck. So why did we have boats for transportation? This is a 1970s postcard, and it looks east along Balch Passage from Long Branch in the foreground to Stellicum way back there, sort of underneath Mount Rainier. That's McNeil Island with the patches of open fields on the left. And across from that is Anderson Island. And this picture reminds us of what the terrain was like when the first explorers arrived. It was heavily wooded all the way to the shoreline, and often there were high bluffs. Obviously, there were no roads then. Certainly there were no cars. There were just narrow trails. Tacoma historian Murray Morgan called Puget Sound the watery highway, and it was the easy way to move people and goods. Because the sound made communication possible, people could live in the remotest places, like out here on these small islands. And they could still send their goods to market, and they could bring in their supplies. That's why the first communities on Puget Sound did all grow up next to the water. This is a modern picture of a Northwest forest taken by Vashon photographer Terry Donnelly. He kindly gave permission for me to use it tonight. Now here's how one person described his experience of a Vashon forest. Oliver Van Alinda arrived on the steamboat Iola in August 1890 at Langill's Landing, which is on the west side of Vashon, just about due west of Center. Van Alinda was from the plains of Nebraska. Have you ever been to Nebraska? Did you count how many trees that you saw? Well, Van Alinda's first experience of Vashon was to walk through this forest from Langill's Landing to Center. Giant fir trees, he said, 300 feet tall, towered over him in an impenetrable wall, flanked by great banks of ferns. He must have been terrified. He believed, he wrote, that the forest was filled with hordes of bears and catamounts just waiting to pounce. So at one time, he made it safely, by the way. At one time, to cross Vashon Island, it was easier to catch a steamer on the west side and take it into Tacoma, change boats, and get on a steamer back to the east side than it was to try to walk across the island on foot. You could walk, but even when the giant trees were cut down, their great stumps remained. And when those were cleared, the rain made muck and mire. Really, the easy way was to go by boat. And another modern picture, a map of today's Washington State ferry routes. It does not include county ferries or private ferries. So today, Washington State Ferries has just 11 routes, and these are served by 21 ferries. And to give you a sense of the size of Puget Sound, from Port Townsend up here at the top to Olympia down at the bottom, the entire shoreline around the perimeter is 1,332 miles, and that encloses 1,020 square miles of water. Murray Morgan estimated that during the years of the Mosquito Fleet, 1836 to about 1940, there were about 1,000 different boats. And in 1907, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer listed just for Seattle alone that one year, 33 steamer routes that originated from Seattle alone. And those were served by 69 steamers. So today, we're down to 11 routes served by 21 ferries for Puget Sound. And that is everything from Tacoma north to the San Juan Islands. I should point out that does not include any of the South Sound from Tacoma to Olympia. Well, did all these boats look alike? No. The big boat in the top picture is the Yosemite. And I'm sorry, but the doc does obscure just how big she is. But she was probably the largest one at 300 feet long that we had on Puget Sound. She spent her life as an excursion boat, and she's shown here unloading people who have come to Boston Harbor, which is near Olympia, to look at real estate lots that are for sale. And this was in 1907. The bottom picture shows the Swan in Quartermaster Harbor, and this was taken about 1883. Now she's only 32 feet long. Basically, she's just a rowboat with a little engine in her, but she could handle 5 or 6 passengers. Her owner, Salmon Sherman, one of the island's first settlers, made one trip a week on Saturday into Tacoma. He took milk and other farm products to market, and he brought back mail and supplies for the islanders. Passenger fare at that time was 50 cents per trip. In today's money, that cost a little more than $13. Sherman's schedule was flexible. It depended on the roughness of the weather, the wood supply, and whether or not he had other farm jobs more urgent. And I want to point out that down here next to the shoreline, that long, skinny little boat, that's a native canoe, and that was a common sight on the harbor in those days. Now, propulsion does not define a steamboat. Of course, all steamboats burned fuel in order to boil water that produced steam. And the steam power turned a side wheel, a pair of side wheels, obviously, or a stern wheel, or a propeller. This boat we have here is the 100-foot Beaver, which was a side wheeler. In 1836, she was the first steamboat on Puget Sound. She came on the deck of a sailing ship from England, where she was built, and she went to Vancouver, British Columbia, where she was delivered to the Hudson Bay Company. Her regular route, which she did for 52 years, was from Vancouver, BC to Olympia. In this painting, she is shown passing by the village of Stellicum. She carried a crew of 18 plus 3 woodcutters, and that's because she burned 40 cords of wood a day, the most of any steamboat. No chainsaws. I want to talk for a moment about what the Susie and the Beaver have in common. And the easiest answer is that although they looked vastly different, they were both steamboats. The Susie's not particularly a Vashon boat. She was basically from Fox Island and Gig Harbor. She was first owned by Fox Island Clay Works in 1888, and they bought her to haul their bricks and tiles. The Clay Works hired 2 brothers from Gig Harbor, Emmett and Arthur Hunt, to be the skipper and the engineer. And later the Hunts bought the Susie for themselves, and Arthur later again became a partner with a quartermaster harbor captain in a steamboat company. Anyway, while working for Fox Island Clay Works, the Hunts took on a lot of other jobs. And one of their contracts was with the city of Tacoma to dump the city's garbage somewhere out in the Sound every day. No one cared, because I think the prevailing attitude was that the tide would just wash it all away and it would be clean again. No one thought anything about pollution. Similarly, no one thought our endless forests could be lost forever. So no one had reservations about cutting 40 cords of wood for one day's fuel for the Beaver. And that was just one boat. When it came to burning wood, they all burned their share, and it was a lot. So the Beaver and the Susie are examples of ignorance about conservation, about the environment, and about various forms of pollution. Now here's a stern wheeler, the Zephyr. She doesn't look like much, but she was durable enough to have a 35-year career. She ran from 1872 to 1907. She called at Vashon on her regular Olympia, Stellicum, Seattle run. And she also stopped anywhere a flag was raised. Now, while the Zephyr had regular ports of call, usually at a dock, a settler could run up a flag as a signal that they needed a ride. And then if there was a float, they could wait on that. If not, they could row out to get on board. When the Iola began running, she carried her own dinghy, and she picked up passengers from the beach. Vashon, by the way, no one knows, at least I know, I don't know for sure how many docks exactly, but Vashon had at least 34 docks, and still settlers waited in other places along the shore. The Messenger, this steamboat, has been described as looking like a cardboard box sitting on a raft. She was a really successful stern wheeler, though. She ran the same route as the Zephyr, only she did it on opposite days. But the point is, as a stern wheeler, her hull only drew 8 inches of water because stern wheelers were flat bottomed with a shallow draft. They could pull up safely close to shore, as you can see here, put down a ramp, and load and unload their freight and passengers. It did not matter how low or how high the tide was. This ability to get close to shore was a big advantage over a deeper hulled boat. The last side wheeler on Puget Sound was built in 1888. The last stern wheeler was built in 1915. Propellers then were the propulsion system of choice. Steamboats burn various fuels too. Wood was the first fuel, then coal, later diesel and gasoline. For many years, the forests were the enemy as the farmers tried to clear them so they could graze their crops. So cordwood was in demand. So how much cordwood does a steamer burn, really? I don't know. And as far as I know, no one else does either. This dock at the north end of Vashon gives you an idea, though, of the kinds of loads that were created. To orient you, a cord measures 4 feet wide by 4 feet high by 8 feet long, and these are stacked the length of the dock. Generally speaking, on average, it took about 5 cords per hour to fuel a stern wheeler. Even an efficient propeller boat like the Flyer, which was fast and streamlined, she burned 24 cords of wood to travel between Seattle and Tacoma, I should mention. She ran 4 round trips a day. She burned 24 cords of wood to travel 240 miles every day, and she did it for 28 years. I've done the math. 2 million miles. At that time, she carried 3 million passengers. She never had an accident. She just burned a lot of fuel, 245,280 cords of wood in 28 years. And I should point out that that road going up the hill behind the dock, on today's north end dock, that's the road that goes up past the parking lot. So that'll kind of orient you. The road that we use to go down to the dock now isn't there yet. What was the cargo for steamboats? Well, if you could load it or tow it, they did it. A mail route was the most desirable because it was a steady income no matter what other kinds of job you could or couldn't get. And of course, they carried passengers. This is the Sophia. She was a quartermaster boat, and she was the first boat owned by Frank Bibbins in 1890. When he began his route each day, the foredeck was so loaded with cordwood that passengers had to climb over the pile just to get on board. So farm produce was quickly delivered to market, as were fish, clams, and oysters, also brush like huckleberry or salal for florists or gel, and building supplies, bricks, shingles, timber, hay, grain, poultry, farm animals. A West Pass rancher needed to ship a bull. So incredibly, he got this bull to stand quietly on a wooden base while he built the crate around him. This crate with a bull in it was then wheeled to the steamer landing at low tide, and the crate was slid onto the top deck of the Virginia Three. Amazingly, that bull stayed pretty calm, but it irritated him to have the gangplank dragged past his cage. Now no longer docile, the bull literally exploded that crate and exploded free. The deckhand who was nearby ran lickety-split for the stern and then successfully turned the corner and darted up the port side. But the bull was not so fortunate. He missed his footing and did a high dive into the Sound. The subdued bull was retrieved, unharmed, again completely calm, and delivered safely without his crate. In June 1887, Captain John Vanderhoof became master of this boat, the Iola, and soon after that, he remodeled the cabin into the living quarters for himself and his wife. One foggy morning on the West Pass off Vashon Island, Mrs. Vanderhoof left the pilot house saying that she would get the cabin ready and prepare lunch. But in shaking a rug over the side of the boat, she lost her balance and fell overboard. She was not seen from the pilot house. She was not heard over the noise of the engine. And she was not missed until the boat had rounded the north end of Vashon and anchored on the northeast side. Captain and deckhand found no lunch, and more importantly, they found no Mrs. Vanderhoof. So the captain's only choice was to retrace his path, and he did not expect to find her alive. Meanwhile, kept afloat by the air pockets trapped under her voluminous skirts, and I like to think that Mrs. Vanderhoof is the woman with the wide skirts there standing on the deck. Anyway, she was kept afloat, and her cries for help were heard by Thomas Redding, who was working on the beach near Cove. He rescued her in his skiff, and when Captain Vanderhoof arrived, she was cold, but she was safe, and she was very nearly dry. And he is said to have remarked, "Well, I thought for sure the devil had her." So Captain Vanderhoof was known for more than just once losing his wife overboard. He was also noted for expressing himself in colorful language. In 1892, Captain Vanderhoof put this 80-foot stern-wheeler glide on the Seattle-Tacoma route, running east and west passes on opposite days. Billy Phillips, later himself a renowned master, was then still a deckhand, and it was his job to row ashore for passengers. And he was not supposed to make the boat late on its schedule. On the West Pass one morning, a rancher asked Billy to wait while his neighbor gathered up a crate of eggs. Phillips replied, "Time and tide and the steamer glide wait for no man." And it didn't. It left without the farmer. On the next trip into town, the eggman, still really quite upset, hailed the glide. But when he came back that day, he was all smiles, because between the missed boat and this trip, the price of eggs had risen from 9 cents to 12 cents a dozen, and he had made a rather tidy profit. Captain Vanderhoof liked Billy saying so much that he tried to co-opt it, and he was overheard telling a late passenger, "Time, tide, and the steamer glide, wait for no son of a bitch on the west side." So this is a different picture of the Sophia from the one I showed a few slides earlier. This one shows a boxy little cabin behind the pilot house, about 4 feet by 8 feet. Excuse me, I think that's only about 6 feet. It was a smoking room for men passengers. Some boats were fancy enough to have smoking rooms for men and parlor rooms for ladies. It was presumed ladies didn't smoke. Fred Sherman, who was a son of Salmon Sherman, is in the pilot house. Frank Bibbins is standing in front of the pilot house on the deck behind the little boy in the white shirt. Frank Bibbins started this transportation business with the Sophia, which he had bought from the Lorenz family. And the Lorenz family had her built in 1884 at Lake Bay. Bibbins bought her in 1890, and then in 1895, he took on a partner, Captain Chance, which is short for Chauncey, Wyman. Like Bibbins, Wyman lived up near the head of Inner Quartermaster Harbor. Captain Wyman is famous for having trained a dog to stand on the dock by his house and bark in response to Wyman's whistle. This was particularly useful when it was foggy. But one foggy day, a customer who was waiting for the boat got really annoyed at all that noise the dog was making, and he chased him off the dock. The dog ran along the shore, still barking, and Captain Wyman followed him so accurately, he ran the Sophia right onto the beach. This is the wedding photograph of Chance and Gertrude Wyman, who were married in 1889. Both husband and wife held master's papers. In 1907, Gertz was the first woman's pilot license on Puget Sound, and only the second in the Northwest, after a woman in Oregon who skippered a boat on the Willamette River. In fact, there was not another Puget Sound woman who earned a license until 1914. Gert captained both the Vashon and the Verona, and was one of the prototypes for the film character Tugboat Annie. The Wyman home still stands at the foot of Monument Road on Quartermaster Harbor. Starting in 1897 with this boat right here, Matthew McDowell built a series of boats whose names all began with the letter D. Defiance the first, the Dauntless, Defiance the second, Dove, Daring, Dart, and Daily. Each one had a little more capacity than its predecessor. The McDowell family lived at Caledonia, which is on the mainland, not on Vashon, between Browns Point and Dash Point, just north of Tacoma. Now, his route was to run from Tacoma, stop at Portage on Vashon, and then go into Seattle in the morning. And then he returned home along that same route in the afternoon, only in reverse. Now, one of the things you have to remember about boats is the captain is the king. His word is law. Now, in this case, Matthew McDowell owned the boat, but he was an engineer, so he had to obey the captain. The possible date for this story is around 1900, and I'm going to take responsibility for naming the names and the boat and the people who were involved by putting it together with the dates when the store was built and the boat was built and so on. But the story was told by Vashon author Roland Carey in his book, The Sound of Steamers. But he was very cagey about identification and not specific as to which steamer, though I think it was the Dauntless, or whether the engineer was Matthew McDowell, which I believe it was, but it could have been one of his sons who were also both engineers. And not even for sure who the waiting passenger was, though I'm pretty sure I know based on the date that the store was built. What we do know is that the captain was E.A. Campbell. During the years that Campbell worked for Captain McDowell, worked as captain for Matthew McDowell, they were good friends. But on this day, Captain Campbell signaled slow in order to come into the dock at Portage. In the engine room, Engineer McDowell glanced out the port window to see who was waiting on the dock. One of those waiting to get on board was the local storekeeper. Quite probably, given the location, this was Charles Van Olinda, who owned the store at Portage. Now, whoever the storekeeper was, this was a person who had been lobbying for lower rate fares on the McDowell steamers, and this had made Matthew McDowell angry. So taking matters into his own hands, literally, Engineer McDowell ignored the slow command and opened the throttle to full speed. Captain Campbell, vastly startled, rang the engine room cord again, slow down, with no result. Frantically, at the last moment, he spun the wheel to avoid ramming the pier and the steamer careened by under a full head of steam, leaving all the passengers stranded on the dock. In an understatement, Carey noted that this incident put a strain on the friendship between Campbell and McDowell. He didn't say how any friendships fared with the Van Lindes. So in 1915, Vashon Island people started a movement for a car ferry service to the mainland. By that time, there were cars on Vashon, and steamers could haul cars. They loaded them just like they loaded any freight, but there's no car deck, obviously. So most cars, when they did get loaded on a steamer, were put crosswise on the bow and had to be manhandled on and off. Not a pleasant job, I would expect. But from the lobbying to have the car ferry service, the ferry Vashon Island was built in 1916. And in November of that year, it was already operating between Portage and Des Moines on the mainland. And it was the very first cross-sound Puget Sound ferry route. Matthew McDowell was then the first of the Puget Sound steamboaters to see the handwriting on the bulkhead. So he began, knowing that the era of the steamboat was over, to systematically sell his fleet of boats. The Daily was the seventh and final D boat. In 1918, she was the last boat he sold, and he sold her to the Canadian Pacific Railway for the Victoria to Nanaimo route, and he retired to his home in Caledonia, at Caledonia, I should say. So another famous Vashon Island mariner was Billy Phillips. Billy's on the left here in this picture outside Tacoma Tug and Barge in Tacoma. He started out as a deckhand, as we know, on the Glide, and over the years he served on many other boats. But his first job as captain, about 1904, was on the Dove for Matthew McDowell. Then when McDowell began selling off his boats in 1916, Billy Phillips moved to the Vashon Navigation Company, and over the next 20 years, he commanded the steamboats, the Vashon, the Verona, Vashon II, Vashona, and Concordia. In 1936, he moved to yet another company and became captain on the Virginia 5. Then still moving with the times, as the Virginia 5 itself was sold and no longer doing passenger service, he became the ferry captain. And in 1949, he was piloting the ferry Kitsap into the slip at Point Defiance when he had a heart attack. Amazingly, he slumped to the floor, but the boat glided safely and gently into the slip as though his hand were still on the wheel. He died a few days later in his home in Burton in August 1949. So to go back a bit to 1904, in 1904, the partnership between Frank Bibbins and Chance Wyman was dissolved. Wyman got together with John Manson from Docton, and they formed the Vashon Navigation Company. They commissioned John Martin Olich of Docton to build their first boat, the Vashon. And that contract in 1904 was what established Martin Olich Shipbuilding Company. Martin Olich became famous for building safe and practical boats, tugs, yachts, passenger steamers, fishing boats, and the company enjoyed a quarter century of success at Docton. So after the split with Chance Wyman, Frank Bibbins then joined Arthur Hunt of Big Harbor, and they formed the Tacoma and Burton Navigation Company. Their first boat was the Burton. In June 1905, the first race between the Burton and the Vashon ended in a dead heat. And this set a pattern for a rivalry between these two evenly matched boats. In fact, much of the history of the boat companies in Quartermaster Harbor on the East Pass, the West Pass, basically all over the Sound, involved rate wars and competitions. A purser would step onto a dock, say. There would be a woman waiting, holding a baby, and he would offer to hold the baby for her. Then he got back on the boat. Well, the woman would have to follow. One more paying customer. Or two boats would race for the dock, and one would bump the other one out of the way so they could get there first. Several collisions occurred, and there were numerous fistfights when the crew, which lost the race, retaliated by engaging in a pitched battle with the winning crew. Once, it was the Magnolia which got to Dockton first, ahead of the Vashon. She was picking up a load of clams, but the Vashon crew swarmed on board the Magnolia to throw the sacks of clams overboard. The sacks broke open, and the clams became the ammunition. This skirmish ended with all the clams in the bay, and neither of the steamers had a cargo. Of course, fares dropped too, and at one point they were only 5 cents per trip. There were lots of lawsuits, suspensions, and fines for the captains over the collisions and the fistfights. But finally, there were agreements about who would handle which route on schedules that did not overlap. This boat, the Magnolia, was built in 1907 by Bibbins and Hunt. And when Bibbins retired in 1909, the Magnolia was sold for a direct Olympia to Seattle route. When her competitor, the Nisqually, left that route in 1918, the Magnolia continued to serve the capital until about 1927. And when she finally did leave, due to lack of passengers, the capital city was then without passenger service by steamboat for the first time in 90 years. Besides his wife, Gert, Captain Wyman was also captain on the Verona. And the Verona is best remembered for being the wobbly ship, International Workers of the World. She was chartered to take 300 wobblies from Seattle to Everett for a free speech demonstration on Sunday, November 5th, 1916. This was a day that came to be called Bloody Sunday. When they got to the Everett dock, they were met by an armed mob of citizens, which included lawmen. Someone fired a shot, and later both sides accused the other one. This created pandemonium, and the crowd on the boat raced to the side opposite the gunfire. This caused the boat to tip. A rail gave way, and many of the passengers fell overboard. It's not known for sure how many were lost that way. 175 bullets alone hit the pilot house. They were counted later. Captain Wyman hid behind the iron safe when a bullet came through a window and splintered a spoke in the ship's wheel. On deck, someone had the presence of mind to crawl forward and cut the bow line. The Verona returned to Seattle with 5 dead and 31 wounded on board. And recently, someone has made a whole movie about the Verona and about the International Workers of the World, which we have a copy, and sometimes we show that. This is the Concordia. The Concordia was the last boat built to carry passengers from Quartermaster Harbor to Tacoma, and she served until about 1942. You may wonder why she has such a curiously shaped hull. Originally, she was designed to be 67 feet long, but the owners learned that with a length of 65 feet, they could get by with one less crew member, so they had nearly 3 feet lopped off. This made the stern square instead of having nicely rounded corners, and it gave her that unhappy, truncated look. Its captain, Billy Phillips, is said to have hated that boat as much as most of his passengers did. So the last great name in Vashon steamboating is Nels G. Christensen. Christensen was a Seattle grocer who moved to the country in 1908. For him, the country was the west side of Vashon Island, but he discovered, because he needed to commute back to town for his grocer's job, that there was no reliable boat service for commuting to Seattle. So he filled that gap by founding the West Pass Transportation Company. His first boat, the Virginia Merrill, was bought from a Tacoma logging company. He dropped Merrill from the name, and she made her first commuter trip September 10th, 1910. All Christensen's boats were named Virginia, beginning with this first one. He distinguished them by calling them by their numbers. Now here is the engine of the one steamboat that still survives today, the most famous steamer of them all, the Virginia 5. For you engineers out there, this powerful and efficient engine is a Heffernan triple expansion steam reciprocating engine. In 1904, it was originally installed in a boat called the Tyrus, which was owned by the Lorenz family of Lake Bay. And when Christensen bought the Tyrus, he renamed her the Virginia 4. Later, he moved the 4's engine into the Virginia 5 when he built her. Miraculously, this engine, lovingly tended and cared for, continues to power the 5 today. 117 years this engine has run. In this picture, in the middle, at the top, just to the right of the fellow in the ball cap, you can also see the Lorenz's Iron Eagle. This emblem was originally mounted on the Lorenz family's sawmill at Lake Bay, and subsequently they had it installed in each of the boats that they owned. But it was sold with the Tyrus, and this eagle now sits on the high-pressure cylinder cover of the Virginia 5 engine. The 5, shown here on her maiden voyage in 1922, is the last operating wooden-hulled steamer of the Mosquito Fleet. She was built on the beach at Maplewood, which is across West Pass from Liza Beulah, where Nels Christensen lived on Vashon Island. And when he had her built, he used all of his favorite features, many of which belonged to his competitors. For instance, the hull was designed after the Virginia 3, which was built by guess who? The Lorenz family of Lake Bay. And they had called her the Typhoon. She also got the famous West Pass whistle from the 3. The superstructure was designed after John Manson's Vashon 2 from Quartermaster Harbor. So the Virginia 5 had only one accident when on October 21st, 1934, hurricane force winds caused great damage in British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. And accounts that I have read suggest that this storm was even worse than the Columbus Day storm in 1962, which I think many of us can still remember. The 5 was just pulling away from Olalla, which is across West Pass from Vashon, when a gust of wind slammed her against the dock so violently that several piling were broken by her guardrail. Of course, all the windows in the passenger cabin on that side were broken. A splintered timber on the dock impaled the 5, and you can see in the second picture, smashed a steam pipe in the engine room. The dock was helpless then, impaled as it was, as the wind and waves pounded her against the dock. You can follow her disintegration in the succession of pictures here. The famous whistle was lost overboard, and after it was all over, it cost $11,000 to repair all the damage. But the 5 was rebuilt, and it was returned to service within 2 months after this storm. The next summer, 2 young boys went diving around the dock to look for the whistle, and they found it, which was actually near the dock. They returned it, and it was reinstalled, and they were given a $5 reward. This is a recent picture of the Virginia 5, taken in Quartermaster Harbor about 10 years ago by Islander Holly Taylor, and she has given her permission for me to use it tonight. During the five's 16 years on the West Pass route, she carried mail and freight and more than 3 million passengers, including thousands of campfire children, to Camp Self. Meanwhile, averaging 46,000 miles annually, or nearly 750,000 miles by the end of her career as a passenger steamer in 1938. Today, she is owned by the Virginia 5 Foundation and is used exclusively for excursions. You can experience a piece of this history for yourself. The Vashon-Maury Island Heritage Association usually sponsors an annual cruise around Vashon-Maury Island in August on board the Virginia 5. Unfortunately, not last year because of the pandemic, and unfortunately not this year because she's in dry dock, and she's in dry dock for a long time, but next year. And when you do go, spend some time looking at that magnificent engine, and then ask the captain if he'll blow the whistle for you, or better yet, if he'll let you blow it. Sometimes he will. There's nothing like that privilege. The boat is a floating artifact. I urge you, take the opportunity to enjoy it.
Thank you, Jean. And thank you so much for talking about the Virginia 5. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. Here is one question. Let's see. Do we know how many Mosquito Fleet boats there were operating at any one time at the height of the steamer age?
Hundreds. Maybe not 1,000 at a time, but I think it's safe to say hundreds. I only know a lot about South Sound boats, so I don't know, how many to add to that for the North Sound and the Orcas Island boats. They came, they went, they were sold, they were adapted for different uses. It's just really hard to keep track. So I don't know. I'm not sure anyone else does either. Try to make a list sometime.
Another project for you, Jean.
Oh, yeah.
There are a lot of people saying thank you, and that this was a fascinating and fantastic presentation, and that you obviously have a great passion for the Mosquito Fleet, and very nicely done. And yeah, more thank yous and wonderful jobs to you, Jean. Thank you. Great job, Grandma. Who is that from?
Oh, that would be from a granddaughter. I have more than one watching tonight.
And thank you for the history. You've got some quite a few relatives watching tonight, Auntie Jean. So somebody says thank you also. So,
I stacked the audience, I'm afraid.
Here's a question. Were there any steamboat races between the fastest boats in the Mosquito Fleet?
You mean official races? No, it was really informal. A lot of the trips were long. Say you were going from Shelton to Seattle. Well, that was a day trip, Even going from Gig Harbor to Seattle would be a long trip. So you'd be coming down, say, the East Pass, and there'd be another boat out there coming out from Tacoma on its way to Seattle. So one of the captains would blow his whistle, and the other captain would blow his whistle, and they'd take off and they'd race. They would race till they got to the dock, and it enlivened the tedium of the trip. And I don't want to say that it was tedious to ride on boats, because you wouldn't believe how many people that when I was writing the Mosquito Fleet book with Robin, that we talked to, who told us what a wonderful experience was, and described the satiny wood in the interior of the Multnomah, and having lunch in the parlor and all those wonderful things. So, but it was a long trip, And so the things that they could do to make it more exciting was something they did. So steamboat races were common, everyday happenings.
Mhm.
Some boats didn't even know they were racing. And there's a story about a boat that waited at the mouth of Commencement Bay. And as another ship came in, he blew his whistle. He was a littler boat, but he had stockpiled a lot of bacon, and he threw it into the furnace, or had his engineer throw it into the furnace. And they won the way. I mean, they beat that other boat to the dock, and the other boat didn't even really know it was racing, but the little boat got theirs. So, you know, they had a good time.
Oh, and I bet it smelled like breakfast. It probably smelled wonderful around there.
That wasn't part of the account, but I hope so.
Another question, when did diesel replace steam for most of the boats?
When did what?
Diesel fuel
Oh.
replace steam?
It kind of came in gradually. I think toward the end of the 1890s and then on into the beginning of 1900. That was why I gave the dates of the last side wheeler built and the date of the last stern wheeler built, because by that time, most engines were shifting from burning coal and wood to burning more efficient fuels like diesel.
Mhm.
So it's not 1 year that you can name. You can kind of name a span of time.
Okay. So someone is saying, when walking the circumference of the island, I see a lot of old pilings. Were they likely all Mosquito Fleet boats?
Quite possibly. I know that if you know where a dock was built, you can go down and kick around in the mud and the gravel and find them. And I know my co-author on the Mosquito Fleet book did find where the dock was at Olalla, for instance, by kicking the beach gravel away and locating them. These were all, the ones on Vashon Island were systematically taken out after ferry service came in and the steamboats had all phased out. Those docks were all removed. And one of the docks, I can't remember, Burton Dock maybe, or Newport, the timbers were used then to build the Judd Creek Bridge, you know. So like the steamboats, the docks also went on to other uses.
Uh-huh. Here's a
So
question.
yes, the answer to that question is yes, it could be, you know.
Did boat owners own any of the docks?
I don't think so. If King County was responsible for them on Vashon, it doesn't sound like they were private docks. There were docks where there were all the little communities. So the little community would have a store and a post office and who knows what else. And the steamboats would land there because that's where the post office would be, you know, and the mail could be delivered. So I don't know who specifically owned the dock. I'm not sure that the steamboat companies own them. I know that Chance Wyman lived at the top of the dock, which was quartermaster dock at his place. And at Rob's Lagoon, I think the Robs owned their dock. So I don't know for sure.
Okay.
I guess a lot.
Okay. Here's a question. Let's see. What year did the Mosquito Fleet end running routes and was replaced by the Washington State ferries?
Well, the beginning date is 1916 when the first ferry was introduced, and that was the Portage to Des Moines ferry. And then later the North End dock was built and went directly to Seattle, because although you had a road and you could catch trams at Des Moines, it later became just more efficient to have the North End dock. By 1938, when the Virginia 5 quit running, and then 1942 when the Concordia quit running, there was almost no need for passenger service anymore because ferries had taken over by that time. So again, it's not a date you can name for sure. It's that span of time between 1916 and 1942 as
Mhm.
one phase became predominant over an older phase that
Yeah.
went away.
Um, so here's a comment, and I think it also speaks to the Virginia Five Foundation and how they're always allowing tours and education. And it says, I was the under captain for the Seattle Maritime Academy, and the day they replaced the rebuilt engine in the Virginia Five, I took my class up to watch the installation by the Foss 300 steam crane, which was judged the only equipment smooth enough to do the shoehorn job.
Oh my goodness. Whoa, lucky person.
Yeah, that's
members
John
of the
Burke.
class.
That's John Burke. Okay, let's see. Do you have info on a boat called Yankee Boy out of Tacoma? I'm 86 and remember as a little boy taking this passenger boat from Tacoma to my aunt and uncle's dock at Tahlequah. Any
Ah,
information on Yankee Boy?
yes, Yankee boat was, I think we considered that a Vashon boat. It was a little steam launch. And it served Spring Beach. And, you know, lots of those little communities down there on the south end, people would take the boat from Point Defiance across to their beach cabin or their summer home here on the island on those little communities down there. And a member of the Vashon-Maury Island Heritage Association who worked on the Yankee Boy has given talks about that experience. The name escapes me now, and I apologize. So there is information about her out here, and anytime anyone wants to tell a story about it, we want to listen.
Yeah. We'll get more information to you, Mr. Nordstrom. Okay. Let's see. I think that's about it for questions right now. Jean, thank you for a really wonderful presentation. And again, I mean, it was wonderful. It didn't quite replace our trip on our annual trip on the Virginia Five, but
Nothing can replace that, Elsa.
nothing
Really.
can. But it sure makes me look forward to next year when we can all be out on the water again.
Excellent.
So,
Excellent.
thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. And we'll say good night. Take care, everybody.
Good night.